The forest was never supposed to be hostile. It was simply a waypoint, a thick stretch of old-growth woodland where the Marine platoon and Army recon squad would regroup before pushing deeper into the valley. But as the canopy swallowed them and the sunlight thinned to pale threads like dying embers, every man felt the wrongness settling into his bones like a cold infection. Captain Harlow, a Marine with 2 deployments and a reputation for reading terrain like scripture, felt it first. A tightening under his sternum, a pressure that made the branches seem heavier and shadows too aware, as if the forest itself leaned in to listen to their footfalls. Sergeant Cole from the Army unit kept checking over his shoulder, pretending it was for tactical coverage. But the truth was hovering in every man's mind. Something was shifting behind them, something that moved without breaking rhythm or twig. The first radio distortion came 10 minutes past their entry point, a crawling static that wasn't really static at all, but broken syllables that sounded almost human, almost like a whisper dragged over gravel. And though the lieutenant chalked it up to terrain interference, Corporal Mendez muttered that he'd heard someone say his name in the static, a claim that earned nervous chuckles that died too fast. The deeper they went, the stranger the air became. It smelled wrong. Damp moss mixed with something metallic and oddly sweet, like rusted sugar. And even the bird songs seemed to retreat, replaced by an undercurrent hum that made their eardrums twitch. When Private Anders stepped briefly away from the formation to relieve himself, he froze mid-motion, eyes wide as he stared into a wall of pine needles, insisting he'd seen a hand, long, slender, bone-white, slip behind a tree like a frightened animal, though its movements were too smooth, too precise, as if studied rather than startled. They laughed it off, but their voices were too loud, too forced, cracking at the edges like overstrained wires. Captain Harlow ordered them to keep moving, his voice low and sharp, but even he couldn't shake the sensation that they were being tracked. Not by wolves or bears or any earthly predator, but by something that remained just beyond sight, always one breath behind them, always patient. The tension snapped when they found the first sign, a shredded boonie hat pinned to a tree trunk by what appeared to be a sharpened antler. But the antler wasn't from any deer. They didn't grow that long, that thin, that twisted like the fingers of a starving corpse. And the hat belonged to a missing ranger team that had vanished 2 weeks earlier. The Marines fell silent as the wind carried a stuttering, hollow moan through the trees, a sound that rose and fell like a creature inhaling their fear, tasting it, savoring it. Something moved in the underbrush, too fast to track, a blur of pale limbs and black eyes reflecting their own shapes back at them like mirrors dipped in oil. Sergeant Cole aimed his rifle, but hesitated, because whatever it was didn't move like anything he'd ever hunted or fought. It moved like it was studying them, reading them, choosing which one would fall first. The teams tightened their formation, boots crunching softly over rotting leaves, breath shallow and synchronized as they pressed deeper into the woods, driven not by orders anymore, but by instinctual dread, the sense that turning back would put them face to face with whatever had been trailing them since their first step into the darkness. And in that moment, as the sun vanished completely and the forest dimmed into a vast cathedral of shadows, every man understood the truth they had been avoiding. They weren't walking through the woods. They were walking into something's territory, something ancient, something hungry, something that had just begun to follow them. The deeper they pushed into the forest, the more the trees seemed to rearrange themselves, narrowing into unnatural angles that forced the Marines and soldiers into a single file line as though the woods wanted to funnel them somewhere, herd them like livestock toward an unseen destination, and every man felt it settling into his nerves like a low-voltage current. Even the seasoned ones who'd patrolled jungles, deserts, mountains, and war-torn ruins knew this was different because battlefields had rules, terrain, enemy, objective, but this place felt like an intelligence in itself, a living labyrinth that shifted just enough to make them doubt their own sense of direction. Captain Harlow checked his compass for the 10th time, but the needle jittered wildly, bouncing like it was afraid to choose a direction, while Sergeant Cole kept scanning the tree-line, his grip so tight on his rifle that his knuckles lost all color, because he could hear it again, That faint tapping, like claws rhythmically clicking against bark, keeping pace with them. Neither retreating nor closing in, simply observing with the patience of a creature that had never needed to rush a hunt. When they halted at a small clearing to assess their bearings, Corporal Reyes knelt to inspect strange tracks carved into the earth. Long, almost human footprints, but with an extra joint in the arch, and toes that curled like talons. And before he could comment, Private Anders shushed the group while pointing upward, where the branches shivered though there was no wind. The vibration moving from tree to tree like something gliding silently above them on unseen perches. A sudden thump echoed from behind, making the entire formation spin around in perfect combat discipline. But instead of an enemy, they found a shredded tactical vest hanging from a branch, still dripping something thick and dark that wasn't quite blood. It was too viscous, too black, too cold-looking, and the sight paralyzed them for a moment because the vest belonged to Corporal Drake, who had vanished just moments earlier when he fell to the rear position during a formation shift. Captain Harlow called for him in a low tone, but the forest answered with a mimicry so perfect it froze every breath. A voice that sounded like Drake, identical down to the cadence, whispering, "I'm here from 3 different directions at once," each whisper slithering through the air with a hollow resonance that made their stomachs twist. The squads backed into a defensive circle, rifles raised, scanning every shadow, every rustle, every flicker of movement. But the forest pressed in closer, as if the trees themselves leaned toward them, listening to their rapid breaths, feeding on their fear. Then the creature finally revealed itself, not in full, but in pieces, a pale wrist slipping briefly between 2 trunks, a flash of black reflective eyes peering from behind moss-covered bark, the silhouette of long, digitigrade legs perched unnaturally on a branch that could never support human weight, each glimpse gone within a heartbeat, leaving behind a nauseating certainty that it wasn't one creature following them but several, coordinated, communicating in silence. Sergeant Cole fired the first shot when something brushed his shoulder, but the bullet splintered only wood, and the forest exploded in a chaotic sound, branches snapping overhead, leaves shaking violently, and the rapid scuttling of something moving too fast, too fluidly, circling them in a tightening ring. Harlow barked orders, pushing the group into a staggered retreat toward higher ground. But for every step they made, the creatures made too, their presence multiplying, their sounds evolving into guttural clicks and low, throaty exhalations that vibrated through the earth itself. As they broke through another section of thick brush, Private Anders screamed. Not from pain, but from horror, as he pointed to a tree where dozens of symbols were carved, crude humanoid shapes surrounded by elongated figures with clawed limbs, all etched in dark, dried material that looked too fresh to be years old, suggesting the creatures weren't just predators, but artists of their own grim warnings. The squads moved faster, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. But even as they escaped the clearing, every man knew they had crossed a threshold. The creatures were no longer stalking. They were herding, guiding them toward a deeper, darker part of the forest where the daylight could no longer reach, a place meant for prey that had already been chosen. The climb toward higher ground should have given them an advantage, but instead the forest seemed to warp around their ascent, the incline stretching into an endless slope that sapped their strength and clouded their instincts, forcing the Marines and soldiers to march in a tightened formation as the sounds of the creatures pressed closer. No longer distant echoes, but deliberate footfalls, soft and synchronized, like something pacing just inside the fog that clung to the underbrush. Captain Harlow felt the weight of command like never before. Every man's life seemed to hinge on each step, each call, each breath he allowed. And as he signaled a temporary halt beneath a broken canopy of gnarled branches, the team realized the forest had grown unervingly silent again. So silent that every heartbeat felt intrusive, too loud, too inviting. Without warning, the silence shattered with a voice. A perfect imitation of Private Anders' mother calling his name, her tone soft and pleading, drifting from a cluster of pine trunks with such clarity that Anders staggered forward, eyes wide and glassy. whispering that he hadn't heard her voice in years and that it had to be real. But Sergeant Cole seized him by the collar and yanked him back just as the voice twisted mid-sentence into a guttural croak, its final syllables stretched into an inhuman rasp that slithered through the clearing like poison. Corporal Reyes scanned the area with trembling hands, insisting he saw a figure perched on a boulder, a tall, skeletal silhouette crouched low like a hunting cat. But before anyone else could confirm, it melted backward into the shadows as though dissolving into mist. The group pressed on, climbing the ridge until they reached a small plateau scattered with broken stones arranged in a crude circle, each stone marked with symbols that looked carved rather than eroded, as if the forest had its own language long before any of them were born, a language written in threats. Mendez knelt beside one of the stones and traced the grooves with a gloved hand, only to recoil as the stone emitted a low resonance, almost like a heartbeat, that pulsed through the ground and into their bones, triggering an instinctual wave of dread so primal that Cole muttered under his breath that they needed to leave immediately, that they had stumbled into something sacred, or worse, something forbidden. As they pivoted to retreat from the stone circle, a new sound rose from the depths of the forest below them. Not the clicking or scraping they had heard before, but a chorus of voices, hundreds of overlapping whispers, all speaking different words, but somehow forming a single coherent message that vibrated inside their skulls rather than through the air. A message that felt like a command, a summons, or perhaps an invitation into the dark. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a frenzy that made several men clutch their heads as if trying to hold their thoughts together while the forest itself pried them apart. And then the first creature finally showed the full outline of its form as it stepped into pale moonlight. Impossibly tall, its limbs elongated with predatory grace, its skin a sickly smooth white like something grown in darkness, and its eyes, two reflective pools of bottomless black, locked onto the group with the cold curiosity of a biologist studying insects. It didn't attack. It simply observed with a calculated stillness, and when Harlow raised his rifle, the creature tilted its head, mimicking the motion with eerie precision before slowly retreating back into the tree line, leaving behind the echo of its breath. A hollow exhale that carried the coppery scent of decay. Panic surged through the formation, not because the creature appeared, but because it chose not to strike, as though waiting for something, timing them, measuring them for whatever purpose had driven it to stalk them from the first step into the forest. As night settled fully, an unnatural darkness seeped across the plateau, blocking out even the faint glow of the moon, and the men realized with mounting terror that they were no longer navigating the forest. The forest was navigating them, guiding their every movement with whispers, illusions, and the relentless presence of the creatures that now circled just beyond the reach of their flashlights, breathing in unison like a single enormous organism preparing for the moment to close in. Night fell like a curtain dropping over a stage, sudden and suffocating, turning the forest into a realm without form, where even the outlines of branches dissolved into one solid mass of endless black. And as the Marines and soldiers activated their night vision gear, the world bloomed into distorted shades of green that only amplified the terror waiting between the trees. Captain Harlow whispered for everyone to keep tight formation, but the moment they began to move, the forest came alive with movement, shadows darting with unnerving precision, figures gliding parallel to their path as though shepherding them deeper into a maze that changed shape with every step. Roots seemed to shift under their boots, branches swung low like skeletal arms, and the fog thickened into tendrils that wrapped around their ankles as if trying to anchor them in place. Sergeant Cole froze when he caught sight of something inches from his face, a pale mask-like visage peering from behind a tree, its features stretched and hollow, its eyes wide and gleaming like polished obsidian. And as he raised his rifle, the creature moved backward in a jerking, unnatural manner, disappearing into the darkness without making a sound, leaving only the faint echo of a clicking breath that vibrated through the night vision lenses. Private Anders suddenly screamed, not from pain but from sheer terror, as he pointed toward a cluster of bushes where a dozen sets of reflective eyes blinked in perfect, synchronized rhythm, like a single organism with multiple heads watching them with predatory patience. But before anyone could fire, the eyes vanished simultaneously, swallowed by the dark as though they had never existed. The squads pushed forward in a desperate march, but the forest kept narrowing, funneling them into a corridor lined with towering trunks that twisted like the ribs of some ancient beast. And overhead, the canopy seemed to pulse with movement. Creatures leaping silently from branch to branch, watching with eerie intelligence, their elongated limbs bending in ways that defied natural anatomy. Corporal Reyes felt something brush his back and spun around, just in time to see a pale arm retract behind a tree, fingers scraping faintly against the bark in a slow, deliberate motion that felt more like a warning than an attack. He shouted a direction, but his words dissolved under a rising chorus of whispers that poured through the forest, surrounding them from all sides, each whisper carrying fragments of their own voices, their own memories, twisted into something mocking and malicious. Captain Harlow ordered a temporary light flare, and when Mendez launched it upward, the white burst illuminated the forest for only a second, but that second felt eternal. Dozens of creatures clung to the trunks around them, some hunched low like stalking predators, others perched high with limbs wrapped spider-like around branches, their faces expressionless masks of pale hunger, their eyes shimmering like deep space voids. All of them angled toward the squads in perfect stillness. When the flare burned out, the darkness rushed back twice as thick, and the creatures vanished without sound, leaving only the memory of their silent shapes burned into the men's minds like afterimages of a nightmare. The forest then shifted again, this time audibly, with a creaking groan that rippled through the earth as though something massive moved beneath the soil, and suddenly the trees ahead parted in a narrow path that hadn't existed moments earlier, revealing a faint glow at the far end, a sickly green luminescence that flickered like distant firelight. With no other option, Harlow led the squads toward the light, though every instinct screamed at them to turn back, because the glow didn't feel like salvation. It felt like a lure, a beacon meant to draw them into the heart of the creature's territory. As they advanced, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, pulsating hum that vibrated through the ground and into their teeth, a sound too rhythmic, too intentional to be natural, and the air grew colder with every step until their breaths became visible streams drifting through the pitch-dark corridor. By the time they reached the source of the glow, a massive hollow tree that stood like a monolith carved by time, they realized the truth that froze their blood. The creatures were no longer just following them, they were guiding them to this exact place, and whatever awaited inside was the true reason the forest had closed around them like a living trap. The hollow tree loomed like an ancient cathedral sculpted by something that understood fear far better than nature ever could. Its bark peeled in spiraling patterns that resembled rib cages curling inward, and its opening breathed cold air that smelled of damp stone, old decay, and something faintly chemical, like the residue of long-dried blood. Captain Harlow signaled a slow advance, though every step toward that vast opening felt like descending into the throat of some primordial beast. And as the Marines and soldiers crossed the threshold, their flashlights flickered violently, reacting to an unseen interference that made the beams distort into warped halos instead of sharp lines. Inside, the hollow expanded far beyond the size any natural tree should allow, forming a cavern-like chamber whose walls glistened with a strange resin that pulsed faintly, almost as if responding to their presence with a heartbeat of its own. And the deeper they ventured, the more they noticed shapes embedded within the walls, shapes that at first looked like twisted roots, but upon closer inspection revealed themselves to be bones, human and animal alike, fused into the resin in grotesque poses as if the tree had grown around the remains of its victims. Sergeant Cole, normally unshakable, whispered that this place wasn't grown but built, that the creatures had formed it as a nest, a temple, or perhaps a prison for whatever intelligence ruled them. And as if summoned by his words, a cluster of symbols etched into the floor began to glow with that same sickly green light they had seen outside. Corporal Mendez knelt cautiously to inspect the markings, but before he could reach out, the glow surged, projecting shifting images across the chamber walls. Images of the creatures stalking through the forest, dragging prey into the hollow, and performing ritualistic actions that defied any comprehension. One creature carved patterns into another's skin, another arranged bones in spirals, and another peeled its own face back like thin fabric, revealing a second, eyeless visage beneath that, opened its mouth in a silent, agonized scream. The men staggered backward as the chamber vibrated with a low resonance, and suddenly the images shifted to something far worse. The missing ranger team trapped inside the chamber, encircled by creatures that watched silently as the victims descended into madness, clawing at their own eyes and screaming words the squad couldn't understand until the sound warped into a familiar voice, Drake's voice, echoing from deep within the hollow. Before anyone could react, something crawled into view at the far end of the chamber, dragging itself out of the shadows on long, trembling limbs. Drake himself, or at least what was left of him, pale and gaunt with black vein patterns crawling across his skin, his eyes glossy and unfocused as he convulsed and whispered in a broken loop. They see, they're waiting. Captain Harlow rushed forward to pull him up, but Drake recoiled violently, issuing a guttural rasp that wasn't human. And as he backed toward the wall, the resin behind him softened, opening like a gigantic pupil that pulsed hungrily before pulling him inside with a sickening suction, sealing shut as quickly as it had opened. Panic surged through the squads, and as they stumbled toward the exit, the tree itself seemed to come alive, the resin pulsing faster, the floor vibrating, and whispered voices blooming into a full chorus of mocking laughter. The creatures appeared then, emerging from tunnels carved high into the chamber walls, their bodies contorting in unnatural angles as they crawled downward with predatory grace, their black eyes shimmering with the same glow as the symbols, and it became painfully clear that this chamber wasn't merely a nest. It was a sanctum, a place of transformation, where the creatures brought their prey to become part of the forest itself. Captain Harlow roared for everyone to retreat, and the Marines and soldiers opened fire, the chamber erupting in thunderous echoes as bullets tore into resin and bark. But the creatures dodged with inhuman fluidity, their movements so fast they blurred against the cavern's pulsating glow, fighting their rising panic. The men sprinted toward the entrance, feeling the air thicken around them as if the hollow itself were trying to hold them in place. And as they burst out into the open night, the forest seemed to inhale sharply, its entire mass shifting with a predatory tremor, as though escaping the hollow had only drawn them deeper into the true heart of the creature's territory, where the forest would no longer merely watch. It would hunt. The moment the Marines and soldiers burst out of the hollow tree, the night hit them like a physical force, thick and frigid, as though the forest had exhaled a breath it had been holding for centuries, and the trees themselves creaked in anticipation, bending subtly toward the fleeing men as if eager to usher them into yet another trap they could not yet see. Captain Harlow shouted for everyone to move downhill toward the riverbed marked on their maps, but the terrain refused to behave like anything natural. Slopes tilted in impossible directions, the ground rippled under their boots like disturbed muscle, and every fallen log seemed to shift positions between blinks. Behind them, the creatures poured from the hollow's many tunnels in unnerving silence, gliding across the ground with elongated strides that devoured distance effortlessly, their pale skin luminescent under the moonlight, their black eyes locked onto the squads with a predator's confidence. No rush, no panic, just the cold certainty that their prey could not outrun what the forest itself wanted to keep. As the men sprinted, a sound rose behind them. Not a scream, not a roar, but a deep, rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the trees and into their teeth, a signal, a summons, something that quickened the creatures' movements until they became streaks of pale motion weaving effortlessly between trunks. Private Anders tripped over a root that hadn't been there a second earlier, and as Sergeant Cole dragged him up, a creature swept past them, its claws grazing the air inches from Anders' throat before it skidded sideways, limbs contorting unnaturally as it prepared to pounce again. Harlow fired a burst into its chest, but instead of falling, the creature twisted with a rubber-like recoil and let out a sound that made every man's knees buckle. A shrill, layered shriek that seemed to contain multiple voices crying out in pain, rage, and triumph all at once. And in response, more creatures materialized from the fog, their shapes forming an ever-tightening crescent behind the fleeing squads. Corporal Reyes tossed a flash grenade that exploded in a violent bloom of white light, and for a brief second the forest was illuminated, revealing dozens, maybe hundreds, of creatures clinging to trees, hanging upside down from branches, or sprinting at impossible speeds through the brush, their movements synchronized like a hive closing in on a trapped swarm. The grenade slowed them only momentarily, for the creatures recoiled from the brightness, but quickly resumed pursuit, now vocalizing low, harmonic moans that echoed through the night like a haunting song. Finally, the terrain opened into a shallow ravine, a dry riverbed littered with smooth stones that reflected patches of moonlight, and the men surged down the slope, but the forest reacted instantly. Trees uprooted themselves with thunderous cracks, roots twisting like monstrous serpents that lashed across the ravine, forcing the squads to dive and roll as branches slammed into the earth with enough force to break bones. A massive root snared Mendez's ankle, dragging him toward the tree line with terrifying strength, and as Cole and Reyes fired at the tendril, the creature attached to it appeared, one of the taller ones, its limbs impossibly long, its spine arched like an animal ready to strike. But Harlow drove a combat knife into the root, severing it and freeing Mendez just as the creature lunged, landing so close that the ground shuddered. The squad scrambled across the ravine, pushing toward a narrow gap between two cliffs that looked like the only path forward. But as they reached it, the forest ahead shifted again, the fog swirling into dense walls that blocked visibility entirely, while the air grew colder than winter steel, each breath burning their lungs. Then, from within the fog, voices emerged, human voices this time, calling their names, pleading for help, begging them to turn around, the voices of the missing ranger team, of Corporal Drake, of fallen soldiers whose bodies they had never recovered, all blending into a single chorus of despair meant to pull them off their path. Harlow screamed for the men to ignore the sounds, to keep pushing forward, and as they broke through the wall of fog, they found themselves standing atop an old service road, half swallowed by roots, a brief fragment of man-made reality cutting through the nightmare. But when they turned back to count their squad, their stomachs dropped. 3 men were missing, erased into the fog without a single cry, without a trace of struggle, as if the forest had plucked them away like fruit. And far down the road, illuminated by a sliver of moonlight, the creatures gathered again in a loose formation, no longer pursuing, but simply watching, waiting, because they knew something the men did not. The forest had begun tightening its grip, and escape was no longer a question of speed, but of whether the forest allowed it at all. The service road felt like a miracle carved into the nightmare, a strip of cracked asphalt offering a sliver of structure in a world where nothing obeyed logic anymore. But the Marines and soldiers quickly realized the forest did not intend to let them keep even that thin advantage. The trees pressed inward on both sides like towering titans of bark and shadow, their branches knitting together above the road until the moonlight fractured into trembling shards, and the oppressive whispers that had guided and tormented them now fell into an eerie, expectant silence, as if the entire woodland were holding its breath for what came next. Captain Harlow pushed the men forward, boots pounding on asphalt that vibrated subtly under their feet, the tremors growing stronger with each step until the ground quivered like something massive was shifting below the surface. And moments later, a deep groan rolled through the earth, a sound so ancient it felt less like noise and more like memory awakening. Sergeant Cole scanned the darkness behind them and froze. The creatures were no longer stalking chaotically, but forming a deliberate formation across the road, dozens standing shoulder to shoulder like an honor guard of nightmares, their elongated limbs hanging motionless, their blank faces lifted as though listening to a command only they could hear. Corporal Reyes whispered that they weren't chasing anymore. They were escorting, herding, guiding the squad toward whatever waited ahead. And as if confirming his fear, the trees parted in a sudden, unnatural shift, revealing a great clearing lit by an otherworldly glow radiating from the ground itself. A light that pulsed like a heartbeat, slow and vast, casting shadows that twisted and writhed as though alive. The moment the squad stepped into the clearing, the air thickened into a pressure that felt like being submerged underwater, each breath heavy and metallic, and the ground beneath them vibrated with a rhythmic force that climbed up their legs, into their ribs, into their skulls, until their vision blurred with the pulse. At the center of the clearing yawned an immense pit, a perfect circle wider than any structure they'd ever seen, its depths glowing with a sickly green radiance that churned like a living sea. And as the men crept closer, the shifting light revealed shapes moving within the abyss. Hundreds of humanoid forms drifting like pale specters, some twisted, some incomplete, some resembling the missing ranger team, and even the 3 soldiers lost minutes earlier, all suspended in a slow dance as though waiting for transformation. Then the creatures entered the clearing, surrounding the men in a widening ring, their movements synchronized, their faces all turning toward the pit with chilling reverence. And suddenly the ground convulsed, splitting in jagged lines that spiderwebbed outward from the abyss as a massive silhouette began rising from the depths. It wasn't a creature, not in the way the others were. It was something older, a colossal amalgamation of roots, bone, sinew, and resin, its form shifting like a living forest given monstrous shape, with multiple faces that blinked open one by one, each pair of black eyes reflecting the terror of the squad like mirrors from another world. The forest itself had a mind, a will, a central consciousness buried in the earth for ages, and now it was waking fully, summoned by the presence of prey that had survived long enough to witness its heart. Captain Harlow ordered the men back, but the forest reacted instantly. Roots burst from the ground like living spears, slashing the air, forcing the squads to scatter in a desperate scramble as the colossal entity let out a sound that shook the world. A howl of wind, earth, and death woven together. Mendez was nearly impaled by a jagged root, but managed to roll aside, firing into the mass of tendrils even though bullets barely slowed them, while Cole tossed explosives toward the pit, shouting for everyone to retreat toward the thinnest part of the tree line. Harlow grabbed a detonator, locking eyes with Reyes as the realization passed silently between them. If the forest had a brain, they had to hit it, no matter the cost. As the men fled, Harlow sprinted toward the edge of the churning pit, ignoring the roots that lashed dangerously close, and he hurled the remaining charges directly into the glowing abyss before diving backward toward the road. The explosion that followed was less fire and more force. A violent shockwave that ripped through the clearing, shattering trees, severing roots, and splintering the colossal entity in a scream of cracking earth. The glow collapsed inward, the pit imploding as if the forest itself were suffocating. The creatures shrieked, their movements faltering into spasms before they scattered in all directions, fleeing into the dark like animals suddenly freed from a master's control. The forest fell still, truly still, for the first time since the squads entered it. Dawn crept through the shattered canopy as the survivors limped down the ruined road, bruised, bloodied, but alive, leaving behind a forest that no longer breathed like a living predator. Yet as they reached the final ridge, Sergeant Cole paused, staring back at the tree line where a single pale silhouette watched silently from shadows. Not attacking, not stalking, simply waiting. And in that quiet moment, every man understood the truth they would never speak aloud. The forest had not been destroyed, only wounded, and though they had escaped with their lives, something ancient now knew their names, their faces, their fear, something that would one day rise again when the woods decided it was time to hunt once more.